Welcome back, everybody. If you could kind of get back to your seat, we'll get started with this session. All right. Thanks again for joining, and I'm Shubhro from Initiative. I'll be your moderator for the session, and we have a terrific lineup of speakers today for the session. There's been one slight change in the order, so I'm going to introduce the speakers formally. And then, the speakers will go, as you've seen in the past session, for 20 minutes. We'll take more questions, depending on the length of responses and so on. And then we're going to break out into the roundtable. So our first speaker is David Goldberg. David Goldberg-Hausner of the EPA. He is the team lead for planning, response, and recovery. And just a couple of words about him. Over the last 30 years, he's developed a national level expertise in the field of resilience, emergency management, and infrastructure protection related to natural disasters, terrorism, and technological accidents. Just recently, he was awarded EPA's Ambassador Award for effective collaborative relationships on emergency management across federal, state, and local organizations and agencies. Welcome, David. Over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. When I saw the session title, which was, how to take all of your estimates, your research, your models into the policy arena, I knew that was a good nexus for me because myself at the US EPA Office of Water, I work with a lot of senior leadership from federal agencies. I develop policies all related to disaster emergency preparedness. And then I also work with the operators and owners of water and wastewater utilities. So I have to use many hats and to talk, but it has to be an understanding. And I go over pretty much what the different hazards are. In my current role, I look at the critical infrastructure, which is water and wastewater utilities. And so I have to be able to explain to them the importance of various disasters. So, and how to be prepared for them. So in reference to that, we conducted, in terms of tsunamis, there's a lot of work that we do not have on tsunamis. So it caused me to be a little bit concerned about that. So we conducted an assessment of the threats of tsunamis to water and wastewater utilities in the Pacific Northwest, even just to start the discussion. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. How many of you have seen a picture like this before? A few of you? Okay, do you know which facility this is? It's a generic facility. Well, this is actually the wastewater treatment facility in Sendai, Japan. Happened, March 2011. And this is workers watching their total huge, Sendai, Japan, it was serving 1 million people. So it's not a small wastewater treatment facility. They're watching their whole wastewater treatment facility be just decimated, washed away on that day. And those are little cars right there. So it's obviously has a big impact and concern for us. Let's see. Okay, so here's the agenda for this talk today. I'm going to talk about a little bit about EPA background. Why is EPA even involved in this? Some people might ask, emergency management. We deal with environmental protection. Why are we dealing with this? I'll cover that. I'll cover a bit on earthquakes and tsunamis and the water sector. Talk about coastal tsunami threats for water and wastewater utilities in Oregon, Washington, and California, and then inland tsunamis. Do you all know about inland tsunamis? Well, I didn't know about it when I first started this, so, and how they affect wastewater systems, water systems in Washington State, and then talk about mitigation measures or some mitigation measures. But anyway, the information that I've received so far from you has been very helpful, and I'll hopefully be able to keep in contact so that I can increase my understanding of this issue as well. So, as far as our EPA background, so I work for the Water Infrastructure and Cyber Resilience Division, so it kind of summarizes why I'm here today. Our mission is to help water, wastewater utilities prepare for, respond to, recover from disasters, natural disasters, terrorism, accidents, all sorts. And so we are a policy-making organization, but we also lean forward, working directly with water, wastewater utilities. And we work in the area of hazard mitigation. We like to encourage codes and standards when appropriate. And so we work with the Lifeline Alliance and other organizations, National Institute of Building Sciences, to help move that along. And anything where we have policy, methodology to develop engineering solutions. They don't want to all be engineered, but they could be protocols, but engineering solutions for disaster preparedness. We do that through voluntary guides. So I've developed earthquake guides, wildfire guides. We have no tsunami guide, looking for something there. Trainings, we also work with FEMA back there. We work with EPA on funding, and we also have a regulatory component. It's not a lot, but it's the America's Water Infrastructure Act, which requires water, wastewater utilities to develop a risk assessment, risk/resilience assessment, and also an emergency response plan. So these are the things we do. We just don't have, we have approaches for all the other disasters, but we have nothing to help the water, wastewater utilities comply with the, for if they suffer from a tsunami hazard. Hope to correct that soon. And then we do provide funding to mitigate, the next step after risk and looking at emergency response plan is to mitigate. So we have our own source of a lot of funding. We have, there's also USDA for rural utilities, and there are not a lot of rural utilities on the coastline in near the Cascadia subduction zone, and the FEMA BRIC funding, the Building Resilient and Infrastructure and Communities program. So we're seeing a lot of ways that even FEMA and EPA can combine our funding streams to make it very effective, a really good deal to deal with some of these hazards and multiple hazards as well. So go back. Okay, so just a little bit about what we've done already on the earthquake side. So we have a video called Surviving the Quake, which is intended to help utilities, utility managers know why they should prepare for earthquakes and how it's going to affect their above ground systems, different from their below ground systems, and to understand all the sorts of dimensions. It's just a basic promo piece, which can then lead them hopefully into a guide, which actually, gives a risk assessment approach and a mitigation. We actually go right down to specific assets. You want a lift station, you have it, or you have the joint, the pipes between the underground and above ground, what that section is, all that we provide mitigation suggestions. And we've now developed some cost estimates for those mitigation measures. So it's really very helpful if they're going to apply for any of these funding, because we already kind of know how much these things are going to cost. And then we also have this last piece, which is interactive maps. And I'll show you a little bit about that, but it's a GIS tool and it's there. You put in your address. It can help you understand what the hazard is for the shaking component, for the liquefaction component. And it also gives examples from utilities. And there are quite a few utilities on the West Coast that provided examples for us on how they mitigated earthquakes. Now tsunamis. So we all know about the terrible East Japan earthquake, 10-meter high tsunami waves. It destroyed the wastewater treatment facility in Sendai. It just left a whole bunch of debris, basically, that's just, and look at just these heavy pipes that are left over, these joints that are just been destroyed by it. So they had to really almost start from scratch. But they did also a lot of plant debris, which I had mentioned to you before. And I do think that, so if you can imagine something like this, obviously there's not a million people on the coastline of the Pacific Northwest, but if you can imagine some destruction like that. So I don't have to go much in this because it's been quite well documented about the Cascadia subduction zone and its importance to address this particular threat with the waves that could be generated. So let's get to the analysis part. So here, what we did was we conducted a tsunami threat analysis for Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. We mapped the data overlaying the inundation maps against the location of the utilities. And EPA identified all the water and wastewater utilities that would be affected by the coastal tsunamis from an earthquake. We mapped that out with the specific utilities are listed there. And this is only the small portion, as you can see, of Oregon's coastline. But you begin to see some of the 48 water utilities that were impacted by an M9 tsunami. I don't know, seaside there? Okay, population and the number of drinking water utilities. So these are the 48 utilities that were impacted. You can see they're divided. We divided them out by size just to get a feel for how large these are. These are really small utilities, basically small communities along the coastline. Important, and then you can sense the population, around 45,000 people whose utilities will be impacted by an M9 triggered tsunami. So mostly small, but it's important to find that, to note, to understand that. Now, with delving a little bit more at the data, this is sort of what we did is we used the small, medium, and large tsunami scenarios by the Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries. Are they here today? Is there somebody from? Yes. So we used your inundation areas, the yellow being the smaller one, the smaller tsunami, orange for medium, and purple for the larger, I guess, earthquake moment magnitude. And as you can see, in this case, we used an example, Rockaway Beach. So this is how we did it. In this case, for a smaller earthquake, Rockaway Beach would not be affected, but the water district is orange because it would mean that it would be inundated by the medium level tsunami, or the tsunami caused by the medium level earthquake, or greater. So basically, we took all of this information and we did it all up and down the coast, so we get an idea of population, as well as, it's just another way to display this. So on the right side, of course, you can see the inundation scenarios, the colors that I showed before, the yellow, small, medium, or orange, and purple, large. And the map on the left is zoomed into the Oregon coastline. The size of the circle is population size divided out in those different ranges, and the color indicates which inundation scenario the water or wastewater system would be affected by. Actually, this is only for drinking water, but you can see we have another one for triangle too. So we also have ranges for millions of gallons per day for wastewater too. I've also, I'm going to talk about the Astoria site as well when I start to begin to show some examples of what utilities have been doing to address tsunami risk. And then this is also the southern part of Oregon, similar data and information as well. So we did it all up and down the coast. All right, Tsunamis are affected by bays and inlets, as you can know that Astoria, certainly on the mouth of the Columbia River, if the tsunami will travel up, hit the vulnerable wastewater utilities, and now recognizing the threat, the city in 2012 decided to conduct a seismic risk assessment. So, and they decided they wanted to reinforce their certain mains to create kind of like a backbone of their water system, so that it wouldn't fail during an earthquake. However, then they started to do a tsunami analysis later and concluded that some of those pipes in the backbone, some of the ones that are especially near the coast, would be significantly damaged during a tsunami scenario. So they metaphorically cut those pipelines from the backbone system, so they wouldn't fail that backbone system. And they also recommended installing some isolation valves near that boundary. You see that boundary of where the inundation zone ends, so that they could do some sort of measure of to prevent the loss of stored water supply. So Astoria has taken some steps, but there's still obviously significant destruction that could happen in this area. So we did a similar analysis along the Washington coastline. Interesting, the numbers for Washington and Oregon are somewhat similar. 62 drinking water utilities serving around 45, 46K residents, so similar to Oregon. And then in Northern California, there were 6 wastewater treatment facilities in the tsunami zone. So I just wanted to move from the coastal tsunamis to the inland tsunami threats. And this is for me, probably just for me, but the inland coastal tsunamis can be caused by the earthquake faults that are near a major body of water. They're not usually as large as coastal tsunami impacts, but in this case, if they're near populated cities, or you just have much fewer or fewer minutes to respond before you could get inundated. So we looked at the one in Seattle. The city of Seattle is one example where this is a large body of water, Puget Sound, the Seattle fault. If the fault goes 7.5 magnitude, it would trigger tsunami waves in Puget Sound of around 16 feet. And that would hit the shoreline within 5 minutes. There are 8 wastewater treatment plants and 11 drinking water utility assets in Seattle that would be flooded, scoured, and have other negative effects. So we reached out to Seattle Public Utilities, and they conducted a sophisticated risk study called Shape Our Water. And there they show seismic results of their wastewater treatment plant and their drinking water, their drainage system. If you looked at the left image, that's part of the Seattle fault zone. That's the on the left side, that's the part that could be by a tsunami. So you can see in the red those areas that would be covered by tsunami. And then they also have a backbone. Their various assets that they've identified would be problematic if they had a seismic an event that caused a tsunami, particularly the above ground pump stations. So and that you can see a number of the pump stations that they've identified as being probably going to fail in these cases. In fact, there were, out of the 67 pump stations, 12 of them are in the tsunami inundation zone and were given high likelihood of failure. So they will be conducting another study about mitigation, how to mitigate these particular assets. Another area that could be subject to inland tsunamis is the city of Tacoma. It has two wastewater treatment plants. One is the central #1 plant, which I've listed here. On the map on the left shows what it would be impacted by a tsunami, and on the right, it would be impacted by earthquake-induced liquefaction. Means the ground's going to be not going to be able to support the buildings like they regularly do, and the pipes and pumps will have to be dealing with a liquefied sediment. So this facility is going to be hit pretty hard. I tried to contact them to understand what I haven't been able to yet, but I'm hoping to get some information about how they're going to deal with the tsunami and liquefaction at the same time. So let's go to our last talk about mitigation. Well, we can look towards Japan as one example. Here's the Sendai wastewater treatment plant, completely rebuilt. There's the design. I visited it when I was there about 1.5 years ago. It's an amazing facility. It's rebuilt in the same location. You might say, well, why? Well, it's because all of the pipes lead to it, so it's too expensive to move it. Concrete, you can see some of the features, the concrete barriers facing the water. You can see the group of trees that are right up there to slow down the water. If there's a tsunami, a grove of trees, they've raised the height of the wastewater treatment facility about 10.4 meters. Remember, the tsunami was about 10 meters. They've installed watertight doors. They've deepened their tanks. They have the evacuation tower where you can see over to the right over there. And in the US, we have our own version that we're going to have to try to figure out. I think the key is that we have to look at each place very specifically, look at the site-specific issues for Hawaii, Alaska, Salt Lake City for inland tsunamis. So we just have to get site-specific data to make it work. This is an example of an evacuation tower that was funded by FEMA. And, there's a couple guides here. We're looking for other guides too that maybe you can help us out with, that we can point to as well. We tried some outreach to our wastewater utilities. I wrote a paper on tsunami threats. So to try to further understand, had a webinar for focusing on the Pacific Northwest, and would love to do other conferences or work with you to help promote maybe some sort of mitigation and risk assessment work. And this is the earthquake interactive maps. This is my last slide. So you can see the different tabs there. We have, disasters, faults, liquefaction. So I thought, well, maybe I should put in a tab for tsunamis there. And so we could have them be able to at least find their tsunami threat. And then maybe in the future, some sort of guide as we go forward. So that's my talk for today.
Thank you, David, for your wonderful presentation and information-rich, experience-rich examples. So I think we're going to take 2 questions. Early career first, please. You got EPA here. Ask away your questions and see how we can facilitate some sort of implementation. I'm gonna go first.
Come on.
Oh, Scribe. Oh, Scribe. Oh, thanks, by the way. Dustin is Scribes. He gets first dibs.
So it sounded like the city of Tacoma is having some issues handling liquefaction and inundation.
Oh, I didn't say that they were having problems because I haven't gotten in touch with them to understand if they've mitigated any. They do have hazards. Yes, they do have the hazards of liquefaction and of tsunami inundation. And I do not know what they're doing. Like, I was able to contact Seattle Public Utilities and talk through what they're doing. But the city of Tacoma, if I'm going to have to try again to see if I can talk with, to find out what sorts of, hopefully acknowledgement that there is this risk and what they can do about it.
Okay, well, I know there's a few people here that live in Tacoma.
Oh.
Is there any advice you can give them to maybe help speed up the process?
I will accept, references from, if anybody knows anybody in the Emergency Management Agency in Tacoma. I'm sure we can then get to the utility pretty quickly. Thank you. Yeah, Elisa.
I'll just add, for the city of Tacoma, the city building official was on the Washington State Tsunami Design Zone panel. So they are aware of the hazards and were active in participating in the code and, so they're aware.
Excellent, excellent.
One more question? Anybody?
In the last slide where you have the web page where you have the interactive map.
Yes.
Are you considering the effect of overland flow or flash floods on the water utilities? I noticed, for example, Florida is kind of absent in these months, so there is nothing there in that map.
Well, this was an earthquake map. So,
Yeah, I don't know
so
if
Florida
it's another
doesn't
one.
really,
No, but I mean, in terms of overland flow and storm surge and flash flood,
oh,
the behavior of the flow in the water is similar to what the tsunamis do.
I see what you're
And
saying.
I don't know if there is any consideration over there, if there is another tab that may include the situation of overland flow in the water utility.
Okay, yeah, we could look into that. Absolutely, absolutely. We do have an inundation and surge map that we use for hurricanes, for instance, so we can alert the utilities that in the next 2 days, you're likely to be impacted by, like for Hurricane Helene, to be able to knowledge. But that sounds like an interesting thing to could perhaps consider. Okay.
Right, we're gonna switch over to our next speaker, Mr. Ronnie Gucci.
Yes, Gary.
Yes. Right, now let me say a few words about you. This is my boss. He is the CEO and co-founder of a company, ImageCap, a risk management company specializing in developing and use of advanced technologies for risk assessment and reduction. He serves on several boards, including the ERI Spectra Journal, and 2 recent achievement awards he's got. He was appointed to the California Governor's Advisory Board on Wildfire Technology R&D, and most recently in 2024, he was appointed as the founding chair of the National Institute of Building Sciences Lifelines Advisory Panel. So Ron, over to you.
All right, thank you. That's the nicest thing you've said to me. Anyway, I want to first thank David for the work that he's been doing in the Lifeline area. You know, this panel that he and I both serve on is very important, very critical, because we feel like, you know, the sort of interest in the importance of lifelines for community resilience has gone down a little bit. And I think we need to do more to educate, to make people more aware that, you know, that a community resilience concept doesn't occur without, you know, not only buildings, but also functioning lifelines. So anyway, I want to first say that as an early career representative, well, I expected a big laugh. That I'm really pleased to see the dialogue, the discussions. And I think, you know, sort of beginning to focus on the difficult issues, things that we really need to get to in order for us to really develop something that would be actionable, something that could be used as a, you know, as a means of getting people to understand, you know, all the tsunamis, you know, why it's important, why we need to begin to focus on these. Okay, so let me see if I can avoid the mistakes that Diego made. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 things. I hope to get to the 3rd thing. I'm going to first talk about what I think are some of the high-level purposes of the tools that not only I will talk about, you know, that Katsu talked about, and we've also heard things about fragility models and so forth, why they're important. And that's what I'm going to get to right here. Then I'm going to cover a study that it's now been about a year in works. The PI is my friend there, Diego Melgar. And want to explain sort of what we've done so far and where we're going with that, because I think it's a pretty important study and the things that we're coming up with should be very useful. And then the final part is to talk about some of the things that we're doing with remote sensing and building inventories. And so working with Washington State EMP, we're able to create a very nice baseline database for buildings. And we're trying to do or to see what sort of things we can do to augment that for other areas. Okay, so I figured you guys, could understand tools, okay, right, tools. So if I talk about tools, like for example, measuring stick, okay, so measuring sticks why are they important? I think in our case here is because we can use measuring sticks to assess basically how bad, how worse, or how critical these events would be. Without sort of a tool to look at what if you had a magnitude, with a 7.8 and not being able to, describe what the impacts are. I don't think that you're going to really be able to make the right sorts of decisions. Second thing is Expedia, right? We all use Expedia. And the idea that we would have a disaster mitigation Expedia, in other words, we have alternatives. We can look at costs, we can look at benefits and so forth. I think it's pretty critical. And I think that when you hear Gary Chalk talk about, the notion of vertical evacuation towers, I think maybe one of the things he'll make is that, maybe one of the difficulties in trying to get these things built is not having the right sort of information to explain to the public why these things are important and what the benefits are. Actuary, okay, this is one for you, for Aon, and that is, I think that, the sort of information that we could produce, certainly from a probabilistic standpoint, certainly look at different outcomes and so forth, is what you need to be able to make the right decisions regarding premiums and how you begin to spread that risk. Safe routes, this is an obvious one here. The tool can be used to look at, justifying or at least indicating safe routes. And then finally, this is ChatGPT. We use this all the time, right? There's nothing you don't use ChatGPT for. Anyways, I'm not saying use it for emergency response planning, but the notion of being able to use machine learning, artificial intelligence, the ability to have tools that allow you to very quickly assess what the different outcomes are, I think is going to be very important and really useful for emergency planning. Okay, so the study that I'm going to talk about is called Leveraging Earth Observation Data and Products, and that's very important because the sponsor is NASA. And what we describe to them is a real opportunity to be able to use that technology as well as modeling and simulation to be able to estimate tsunami losses. And one of the things that I was very interested in discussions this morning was climate change, because things are going to change in the future. It's not just only the hazard, the development, the exposure is going to change with time. And what we have now is going to be very different, 50 years from now. So you need to take that, I think, into account as well. Here's a nod to the sponsor. NASA under its disasters program. Some of the key players here are University of Oregon is the prime organization. Ohio State University is involved. My company, Tohoku University, along with Koshimura, his startup company, which is great in Japan, to be able to take research products and actually share that in a way that they can be used for insurance purposes, for example. So anyways, this is a team. And what were some of the problems and challenges we were looking at? So the first thing, we thought that there was a real gap in terms of a probabilistic framework for looking at not only hazards, but risks, okay? Also looking at, the sort of outcomes. It's important not only to look at financial losses and maybe, losses on humans, but the societal impacts, are there things that we can begin to think about in terms of adaptations to mitigate those effects? And I think in order for you to do that, you would need a tool like we're going to be discussing. Updating models and data I just described, there are a lot of reasons why you want to make sure that there's an element that does address climate change. And here's the one of the important things, it's item 4, physics-based models. Okay, we think that there is a lot that can be accomplished using empirical data. But we also think that, there could be some intricacies that, that having a physics-based model would really allow us to look at, what are the important factors, and then we could look at what impact they have on our final results. So you'll see a lot of what we will be doing. In fact, what Diego discussed a little bit this morning is in that area. In fact, Koshimura with his inundation modeling is also part of this. And then finally, using geodesy in a sense of trying to look at near real-time effects. And that's something we're studying. It's got a lot of challenges, but we think that, when you begin to look at response, that might be an important technology for us to look at. Okay, our deliverables are here. We want to make sure we produce a scenario plus probabilistic set of risk and loss results. And we want to do it for different time periods. So short, time periods, decadal, as well as long-term scales that could incorporate the climate change impacts. We have already selected 6 study areas along with our partners. We've worked with Washington State to select 2 in Washington, Oregon, there are 2, and in California, there are 2 sites. So we want to get all along the West Coast there. And then finally, case studies. And these are very important because one of the points that I try to make is that it's very hard to demonstrate the importance of, what you're doing without case studies. Things that, that have been validated, made by actual events and so forth. So we're paying a lot of attention there. And most importantly, we want to make sure that we have a feedback loop where you've got the users able to feed into, different parts of our study as we go along. Okay, so what are the requirements? And Diego knows how we got to this point here. Diego and I both had separate NASA grants under the disasters program. And Diego calls me up one day, he says, hey, I want to get into the risk area. And I said, oh, okay, because he and I really never talked before. And he said, I really would like to see if we can extend what we're doing in the hazard area into risk. And this is where I think Amy Williamson, was involved as well in trying to make, that sort of thing happen. So we selected a Cascadia event 929. We selected ocean shores. Our end product here was to produce loss estimates, as well as casualty estimates, and also to look at evacuation planning. And we wanted to make sure that the results could be used for various entity groups. And this is what I think really sold NASA into investing 2 years, a 2-year study for us to do this. So the example here is ocean shores. I think a lot of you know this area here. So it's a small community, 7,000 people, mostly residential. You've got some commercial, but it's very flat. Okay, so you can think about, you don't have to have a tsunami. There may be just a very big storm that could cause, damage. So this is the study area. This is getting back to the kind of the physics-based elements of our project, earthquake sources, and we think that the idea of being able to model the effects of just a whole broad range of magnitudes, locations, and things are very important in terms of meeting this probabilistic goal, for our study. Diego showed this this figure this morning, And it was great because now I understand what he was doing. But the idea that, you have to run a lot of iterations in order to converge, to, these tsunami thresholds and things like that, is a very important thing. And this is really the genesis for why you need a very large event set. And once you've got that, you need to, be able to translate that into loops. I guess the animation doesn't occur. Tells you that I tried. Anyways, this is his professor's figure here, and I can tell you that it took up like I don't know how many megs in my PowerPoint file, but it's very, very, very illustrative how the inundation could be modeled, using a more of a physics-based approach. So the end result here is that with the magnitude 9, we're predicting the maximum water level. And this is the old, very large area, but basically results down to here, and this is ocean shores right here, that you're looking at, anywhere from, 1 to as much as 10 meters, where you get very close to the shore. Okay, the other element that is very important, in fact, I think we did a great job this morning in trying to kind of piece together the various components of the hazard. Somebody talked about the exposure, the importance of buildings. And, in fact, I think it was you, Katsu, where you talked about, if you have a very poor building database, that can greatly affect, certainly the financial losses, if you do the calculation. So here we have essentially census blocks, population by each census tract. The darker areas represent, higher population levels. Then in these two panels right here, you've got basically the inundation hazard, where if you assume that, for example, any area that is greater than 1 meter, 0 meter inundation, 1 meter, that you would have a risk. In this case right here, you were saying that you can maybe, absorb several meters without having people, die, for example. And so we wanted to look at that in order to define safe zones. Okay, so here you see for, the more extreme situation, you've got a lot of buildings and a lot of people in these buildings that would have a long way to get to a safe zone. Okay, whereas if you're a little bit more flexible in terms of that threshold or criteria, then you maybe you have a larger safe zone that you can work with. Okay, so what does all this mean in terms of inundation, et cetera, on losses and people? So here's the maximum inundation for the ocean shore area as well as surrounding areas. And if we were to take that inundation level, fragility models, and we started with the HASIS fragility models, and that's something we're coming back to because this is a pre-award calculation, coming back to see if there's a better way to update these models. But using those models, we come up with estimates of damage to buildings and to contents. Okay, and the damage to buildings, would be reflected by the blue lines or bars, and contents would be the orange bars. And this would be plotted as a function of the flow depth that would eventually be experienced at those various sites. So you can see, like for about maybe 4 meters, 5 meters, or feet, maybe 25%, 20% of the damage occurs at that level or lower. But once you start getting to 10 feet, the great majority of the damage is reflected there. So you have some idea of how that damage is distributed, not only regionally but by flow depths. Okay, you can take it even finer look. So here's the inundation building footprints, and if you look at the building population exposure as a function of time frame. Okay, so here 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, all the way down to 100. 20 minutes or 2 hours. The amount of buildings and people that are exposed during those timeframes are reflected by these rows. So 10 minutes, roughly 900 people, buildings, 1,000 people, and that's about 14% of the total population. In the case of say 20 minutes, you add in another 1,500 buildings, another 1,700 people. This is cumulative right here, so you've got 38% of the population now that are affected by the inundation, and all the way up to 30 minutes and then beyond. And this is important here, I think that, what's that?
Oh, didn't get you.
Oh, okay, all right. Do you want me?
We have the other
Back
mic
on?
there.
Okay.
Sorry, that was the 2-minute warning, but
All
did
right,
not meant to
well,
cut the mic.
Sorry about that. Okay, I can start kind of. Anyway, the idea is that you could also translate this into damage and loss, much like Katsu has. So for structure, non-structural, we're looking at using damage, hazardous damage functions on the order of 3 billion, 2 billion, and so forth. And if you look at the total there, it's about 6 billion, which is very close to the total exposed value in that area. So that's, yeah, it's like over 90%. Okay, I think one of the more interesting examples of how you would use loss estimation simulations is to look at evacuation. So here's a case where we're trying to estimate the number of injuries and fatalities from this magnitude 9 event. And what is important is you need to know that there's a play between tsunami arrival, okay, and evacuation times. So, you know, if you can evacuate before the tsunami comes, you know, then you don't have this sort of you don't have a fatality or casualty. But if you don't, then that's where you begin to rack up, you know, the casualties. So here's a case and the other thing I want to mention is that there are, we use the USGS PEAK tool, the pedestrian evacuation analysis tool. And that tool allows you to model things like how fast people try to move, slow, fast walk. It also has a parameter which models the delay in getting any sort of alert or warning time. And then finally, the community preparedness level. Okay, so using all these different parameters, you can look at a very worst case or a very, very, say, optimistic case, which is, you know, these different bar charts are showing. Okay, the interesting part, and this may be my last slide, is that if you look at the either fatality or casualty rate as a function of walking time to full safety, and if you remember the map, you know, there's certain areas that you needed to get to. You get some very interesting curves. So in this case here, the red represents the worst case, because we ran about 50 different scenarios to create at least the information to map here. The green represents the most optimistic case, and the yellow is an indication of what the sort of average case might be. So this kind of bounds, you know, what the possibilities are. The solid lines are for casualties. The dashed lines are for fatalities. So you can see, for example, maybe 30 minutes, you're looking at the worst case. You've got a very high percentage of the people that are going to have some sort of casualty. And if you look at the best case, you know, you have a much better chance of surviving. Now, if you look at the fatality case, and these are the casualties are kind of nice, you know, sort of smooth curves, but the fatalities have these very strange plateaus that go up like this. And the reason being is that, you know, you're looking at a comparison of, again, tsunami arrival times, and you're looking at evacuation times. So what's happening is that at these points right here, that's when the tsunami catches up, you know, with the people in the area. And so therefore, you know, the casualties or the fatalities go up, you know, very significantly. Okay. let me use this as I think your poster, Schubert, has this, work package, chart. So if you want to take to see all the different elements that we're considering, go to the, poster session that Schubert is, he's involved with. And I'll just say, I'll stop right here, which is the building inventory stuff. And I mentioned it, in one of the other discussions that some of the reasons why the the structural inventory database is different than what say the Washington State database was, where they had a lot more detail doing field surveys and so forth. Anyway, I'll stop there.
I think it's white. Right, a couple of questions for Ron. Oh, yeah.
Is there another mic or should I just yell?
I think it's out already.
What?
It's back on.
Okay. All right, yes.
Very cool ideas and a lot of applications to inform the policy decision making or the real applications. But I'm very curious. The different people may have different opinions about the usefulness of the fantastic tool. For example, I believe many researchers and insurance companies would like this kind of tools very much. But I'm curious, how do the decision makers and all the emergency managers like these kind of tools? And also in this room, we have some policy decision makers here. I would like to listen to your opinions on these ones. I'm just curious, different people may have different opinions about the usefulness of this, and what's the gap between these tools and the real application. So I just curious, but I don't want you to fight each other. Thank you.
All right, I don't want to be responsible for that. So let me first say that accessibility, one of the important priorities for this particular project is that it will be an open access platform. So it's being designed, and in fact,
Yeah.
you want me to for the recording? So we want to make sure that the broadest set of users can actually use the tool. And so we are spending time to design the platform so that it can be used by insurance companies, by planners. I don't know, I think the results may be useful to it could be accessed by the public. But, we want this to be a usable platform. This is why we're spending a lot of time to make sure that these are open models and it's open accessibility. As far as trying to make sure that we're hitting the spot, the right target. This is why we've got an advisory panel. And this is the reason why, we will be at every one of these types of meetings to be able to talk to potential users to validate or to maybe even get, perhaps maybe an opinion of how it might be better, to move in a different direction. So, it's not like we're just looking full steam ahead and this is what we're going to develop. We're trying to make this a feedback loop. And I think that's the only way that you're going to have a good chance to maximize the usability of this by a broad set of users. Let me mention one other thing, which I didn't mention, which I think is very, very important. So, when we eventually will have like a loss and a return period curve, okay? That loss is not tied to the return period of an event. In other words, it's not scenarios. What is, it's tied to looking at, these hundreds of thousands of events, their individual probability of occurrence, and then basically, stacking up so that you can begin to look at a cumulative set of losses for that return period. So the return period is a return period for that loss not caused by a single event, but by a whole multitude of events. And I think that's the way, you know, from an insurance point of view, you're taking into consideration the fact that these, you know, events could be very broad in terms of, you know, their impact. And we want to make sure we capture and retain, you know, those correlations, you know, between damage and loss, you know, throughout the region. So I wanted to make that point. I did make that point.
Okay.
That's it.
Yeah, I think we are behind, right, like 20 minutes, so.
We have Gary
Oh,
on.
Gary on, okay, so I think we're gonna come back, so our roundtable probably is gonna be a little squished, but that's okay. So I'd like to introduce Gary, you know, really quickly. Gary Chalk is the chair of the ASC7 Tsunami Loads and Effects Subcommittee that developed the tsunami design provisions of the ASC7-16 standard. He was selected by the ENR as one of the top 25 newsmakers of 2012 for his work on developing a national standard for tsunami resistant design. And he's a licensed structural engineer in Hawaii and California. So over to you, Gary, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Let me share my presentation.
Maybe we need the mic to.
Okay, folks, can you see this title slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, guess I should speed up here. So I'm going to talk about tsunami resilient design for high hazard areas, West Coast and Hawaii, basically, and Alaska. We developed the ASC7 standard that is adopted in the International Building Code 2018, and we have updated that in subsequent editions of the standard 722, and now we're working on the 7-28 version of the ASC7 standard, which would become adopted into the IBC 2030. So basically the standard, the mandatory standard is linked to the building code that's adopted by the local jurisdiction. But anyway, it took a long time to get there in terms of essentially events, essentially breaking down the normalcy bias of people thinking that tsunamis were too remote in an event, and maybe we just need to worry about events that had happened historically. And then, of course, the Indian Ocean event and the Tohoku tsunami basically broke through the expectations of people, and I think scientifically people realized that, oh, wait a minute, if we just rely on historical events, they were doomed to a trial and error cycle where we always learn the lessons too late. And so the ASC7 standard incorporates probabilistic tsunami hazard analysis and those mapping products that are used for design, establishing a tsunami design zone, and design run-up elevations is established in a tsunami design geodatabase that is an electronic part of the ASC7 standard. The tsunami resilient design provisions incorporates that is based on physics-based modeling and probabilistic hazard, along with analysis of structural loads and effects to the building and its foundation. And then those requirements are developed into a procedure that delivers a design that meets structural reliability targets, which serves to mitigate losses and reduce risk when it's applied. Okay, so essentially, at this point in time, over a long term, tsunami disaster resilience is possible by design, and it can be used. This standard can be used as a means to provide better planning and as well as perhaps related zoning requirements in high hazard areas. And it can have an effect on how one should site critical facilities and how to design them if they must be sited within a tsunami inundation area. I think the asterisks appear because I think, the ASC 7 standard is a technical engineering standard that is has very strong basis in engineering and reliability, and lays down very specific mandatory requirements for design. As a result, it's very easy for lay people and politicians to basically miss the point entirely and not understand or not even open the book or even read anything about it. Most politicians and other lay people don't read peer-reviewed journals. That means absolutely nothing to them. So it's easy for other people to ignore it or mischaracterize it as something that maybe it isn't if they're opposed to it. So that's kind of the pros and cons of that. Basically, the requirements are based upon the risk category of the structure being designed, where the more important ones have more stringent requirements leading to a smaller probability of failure. For example, risk category 2 buildings, when designed in accordance with ASC 7 Chapter 6 tsunami provisions, would have about a 10% probability of a component failing, structural component failing during the maximum considered tsunami. And then for risk category 3, that probability of failure is reduced to 5%. Risk category 4 is reduced to 3%. And for tsunami vertical evacuation refuge structures, the probability of failure is less than 1% in the event that the maximum considered tsunami occurs. Now, the standard applies to risk category 3 and 4 structures. Those are essentially critical and essential facilities. It takes the local jurisdiction to write a specific adoption in order for the tsunami provisions to apply to risk category 2 buildings, which is the bulk of residential construction. The loads effects, just go through this, they're very, very comprehensive in dealing with all the forces that can be generated. They're physics-based equations backed up by experimental studies, includes also debris impacts and foundation effects. So it's applicable to the 5 Western states. And again, it can be used if used by knowledgeable people, it could have an effect on planning. Not sure whether it has or not. It certainly would have an effect in structural design where it's required. And it could have influence on both disaster reconstruction standards if people pay attention to it. That's perhaps not the instinct of politicians after an event where they're more concerned about making reconstruction easier to speed up and not necessarily with the standards being any different than what they were before. But anyway, it does have that capability if knowledgeable people step forward. Okay, so as I said, with a tsunami design geodatabase, it can be used in planning to assess what the hazard is in the planning before you get into the full design effort, especially if you have multiple alternative sites to pick from. And again, really, for residential construction, what we're saying is that the local government should determine criteria of height and occupancy where tsunami design requirements for risk category 2 buildings should apply and implement it in the local ordinance adopting the building code. So that's where it takes more than engineering and scientific stakeholders to move this forward to actual implementation, because it takes, a sufficiently large constituency to ask for this to be done before politicians would take heed of it. Because it's much easier to say, well, does it cost more to do tsunami design? Yes, it does involve a cost. Oh, okay, well, never mind, we're not going to do it because we're not interested in increasing construction costs. That's a typical reaction. So it really takes a community sentiment that says, well, no, our lives and mean something and we want to be protected. Okay, evacuation, will it be completed? There's lots of emergency management plans about evacuation and assumptions about the population, how fast they can evacuate. There's obviously many people that wouldn't move fast enough or even can't make the distance if they're young or old. They probably, in many cases, aren't going to survive. Once the flow reaches your knees, you're cut down and killed. So it's very, the losses escalate rapidly once the evacuees are caught by the incoming wave. Tohoku showed that there were many tens of thousands of people that were saved by going into buildings, both buildings that were designed as vertical evacuation refuge structures like the one on the right of this picture, as well as other buildings that were just inherently strong and tall. So, there are probabilities of failures of buildings, which, if you apply it to risk category 2 buildings, might be 1 in 10, might have a structural component failure, not overall collapse. But you have to compare that to what's the probability of being killed if you're caught on the ground, which is probably about, 95 out of 100 people would get killed. So can be a dramatic increase in safety if you provide a community that has buildings that can serve as safer refuges, even if they're not, the extremely safe vertical evacuation refuge towers. So we looked at this possibility. We considered 35 locations along the Pacific coastline, but not Alaska in this case. We looked at prototypical buildings that would be designed to the seismic requirements, and looked at, okay, where would the buildings be tall enough to afford an additional story height, providing at least one dry level, and have the systemic seismic strength available to prevent overall collapse, in which case that design could be augmented relatively efficiently to preclude component failures due to the tsunami. So we looked at that, and we went along the coastline from California to Washington and then back to Hawaii. And basically we looked at buildings that would be located close to the coastline, because we want to look at, the circumstances of more severe inundation. And then we looked at what would be the threshold height for a safe reinforced concrete building that would have the seismic strength available to prevent overall collapse and would just need to be augmented by additional tsunami design to prevent local collapse. So in California, the numbers look pretty encouraging. As you go northward where the hazard increases, then the threshold height can get larger, as you can see here in these locations. The threshold height is based on inundation plus 12 feet And, not using a building less than 25 feet. And then in Oregon is probably in many cases the worst cases where you would need taller buildings. But these are assumptions of buildings right along the shoreline. So if you had taller buildings that are strong set back, these threshold heights would dramatically be reduced. And then we looked at what are the zoning requirements. A community has in their development plans, creates zoning regulations that reflect the type of community they want. And in many cases that is related to types of uses or occupancies, economic activity, and building height. So what we found is that in Oregon, in many cases, the zoning height was less than the height that a building needed to be in order to be tsunami safe. In other words, if you build to the zoning heights, you will not have any buildings that have a dry floor. So this indicated that, it's not just a technical feasibility issue. It's basically, would communities decide to create incentives and allow somewhat taller buildings in order to provide a safer community in tsunamis, especially if the evacuation possibilities are not terribly good overall. And in Hawaii, we looked at this issue as well. And in many cases, our northward communities that are located in bays do fairly poorly on this. But in most cases, where we need that type of structures is in the more populated island of Oahu and Honolulu in particular, because in these other areas such as Hilo and Kahului, it is possible within the time given to evacuate. Okay, so we looked at some conceptual planning options, which is, okay, well, if we don't change anything, where would we find buildings that are tall enough, located further away from the coastline, where the inundation depth is less, and where they would have the structural strength to prevent overall collapse due to seismic. And then we just do a little bit of local strengthening. This is basically a minimum economic impact, but also minimum risk mitigation, because you're kind of dealing with buildings that are already towards the landward edge of the tsunami inundation zone. Another option is to look at allowing taller buildings to occur at some setback distance away from the coastline. So essentially, you have, in I guess the local architecture, sort of a tsunami resilient architecture taking place some distance back, which makes some sense to a lot of people, because you're creating higher density of residential construction further away from the coastline. You're not encouraging people to kind of crowd towards the coastline. So anyway, that is another way to look at it. And then thirdly, is strengthening buildings overall and allowing taller heights. And so this might take the place of, okay, well, the community would allow taller buildings if they are designed to tsunami. So there's sort of an economic incentive in development of, well, I can get a taller building with more square footage for economic return on investment if I invest in safety of its occupants by strengthening that building for tsunamis and assuring that the design provides a height that is appropriate for that location. So this would benefit communities. It would mean that the communities would have to decide that, okay, we are going to accept buildings that look bigger and taller in order that we have greater safety, and perhaps it's also an economic benefit to the community to, have more economic activity and other types of incentives. So anyway, those are some concepts that could be implemented, but this takes more than just scientists and engineers to make these options or taking them into effect as implemented risk mitigation. Okay, so basically, I think it's important for communities to evaluate risk. There may be a preference to limit development, but it maybe that's not economical, but where evacuation is not practical, you can create vertical evacuation refuge structures, which are expensive because they have a very small probability of failure. But you could also encourage tsunami design of more robust risk category 2 residential constructions that can serve as adequate refuge places with much greater safety than people being caught on the ground trying to evacuate. So seismic requirements give you a good foundation of strength to leverage to reach the target you need for tsunami design. But there are many locations where there would be strengthening in the most severe areas. And anyway, there may need to be, community zoning regulations that want to be looked at, or incentive options to be created in order to implement tsunami mitigative design on a broader scale, especially considering residential construction. Okay, folks, that's it.
Thank you.
I'll maybe leave this up in case there's
All right,
questions.
thank you so much, Gary, and I think
Okay.
there's a lot of options to discuss, and I think we have the right people in the room to do so. So we had planned for 30 minutes of, but I don't think I want to be the person standing between the bar and the people. So I'll leave it up to you when you want to cut us off, okay? So
Should I stop this here if we're going to general questions to all three speakers?
I think there'll be one or two target questions for you, Gary.
Okay.
And then we'll do the roundtable. So any
Okay, fine.
direct question for Gary? Shall we move on to? All right, thanks, Gary. I think we're going to do more of the general questions for.
Okay,
all the
fine.
speakers.
All right.
Okay, so let's see. I'm gonna bring up the questions up here. I think typically, we review the question and then talk to your neighbor for a minute or so. And then, we'll think about some questions as well. Okay, so these are the two. Are new methods practical for an implementation in every application? I think you heard a lot of the challenges. And then how can we do better so industry and agencies can apply new hazard risk assessment methods developed by scientific community? So maybe a minute or so, talk to your neighbor, and then we'll take some comments and questions. Okay, I'm gonna pull everybody back to the round table mode. So you will have had enough of us. Ron. We're back on the roundtable session. Okay, so. What's the one thing we can do? Maybe one thing we can do to overcome all these challenges that we heard. I have one idea, but I'd like to let you go guys first.
This is probably dumb because I'm just a second year PhD student. But I'm just wondering why there's no people involved. I don't see any like bivariate, like floor flood, like maps. And I think that if you had demographics crossed over with some of this physical science, you could have some better planning. Maybe that's really dumb, but I'm just interested in seeing the demographics crossed over with the physical stuff to see social vulnerability, but I don't see that.
Right, does anybody want to respond to that? She's asking, why isn't there enough emphasis on the social vulnerability indicators? We're seeing a lot of the physical maps, buildings, so perhaps.
I obviously can't really speak to the research side of things because that is not what I do. But I think where we see social vulnerability start to really come in is on kind of the emergency management side, on the planning side, where, if a community is saying, okay, we know we have a risk, where do we want to put our VES or where do we want to put the first one? That is often where that comes in, or, do we have an elementary school we want to put it near? Do we have a senior center? Where are our vulnerable populations and can we put this somewhere where it's going to help them? It also, I think, comes in on kind of the, state and territory level, in that when we are pushing for funding and pushing for the, state and national level changes or policies that we need, that data is really helpful. Like for Washington, and I'm sure it's the same in some of the other coastal states too. Our outer coast population is very old. It's a lot of old, white, rich people. But that means that, they are not getting out of the inundation zone quickly. And, that there's also then a very high occurrence also of disability. And so those are numbers that we can use when we are trying to say, this is why you should prioritize this low probability hazard over something that's happening all the time, but is maybe happening to an area where, folks have more resources or something. So, and that's kind of how we are using it, is figuring out when we are placing those things.
Comment over there.
So I have a project I'm working on, looking at sea level rise changes, probabilistic tsunami hazards in California. And we're going to be using the results from this modeling to do risk analysis using HAZUS, but we're also using Esri infographics to do risk analysis, and Esri infographics data have those the demographics. So I encourage people who are using HAZUS to investigate using Esri infographics, because it can provide the output for underserved communities, and because it has those data split up like that.
So advice.
I think you make a really excellent point, and there's a national effort. I don't know, Kara, if you're going to talk about the National Risk Index tomorrow. She is, okay, so, but we don't have a great understanding, first of all, how many people are even in the tsunami inundation zone across the nation, let alone what types of people and what their vulnerabilities are. So FEMA tried to do this, and they did it at a national scale, and there are issues with the way it was done, and so we're trying to redo it. But understanding who those vulnerable people are, where they are, is really important. And then FEMA is using federal dollars to give grants and funding to those that have the highest risk. And so if you're not classifying risk correctly based on the people that are in that, then they're not getting the resources that they need to build vertical evacuation structures or do more planning or evacuation modeling. And so it is really important to understand who is in the zone and what they need so that we can better define policy and allocate those resources. So it's a good question.
Yeah, so just another couple projects that also involve from the natural hazard until the social perspective of the risk are COPES Hub and the NERI Foundation Consortium. So we have people that are scientists, that are engineers, and they have the social and the educational perspective as well to complement and to facilitate the communication. So another two great examples of these projects.
Yeah, Karina, thanks. I'm glad that you brought up the National Risk Index thing. Actually, a lot of people are trying to use that as a model and to kind of come with localized plans. In fact, we are doing a project for wildfire, not for tsunami, and we are looking at two communities, one in the Central Coast in Santa Barbara and one in Northern California of Sonoma, where there's high wildfire risk, and we are kind of adapting that risk index concept and adding in a whole bunch of social indicators from the American Census, where you have got, if you're interested in data, you go to that site, you can get thousands of social, I don't know, like a large number of social indicators, which you can, pretty much use that risk index, the national risk index, and create something more localized. So that's an important point. Believe it or not, a lot of people are actually looking into adding that dimension to their research work.
Yes, and building on this, I do think we're really after life safety here, ultimately, because these seem so catastrophic. So as an element to this, I do think that there's an outreach component and risk understanding and risk acknowledgement so that people feel like there is options for them to survive something like this and to recover and to rebuild, that it isn't as some of these videos show sometimes that you see from Japan. So I do think that there's an element for outreach and awareness that we should also focus in on how we communicate the risk that we're now and the methods that we're now putting together.
Any other questions?
I'll just quickly add a point that in terms of in particular tsunami vulnerability, maybe you can start with a paper that I published by Nate Wood a few years ago with his colleague at USGS, covering the entire Cascadia subduction zone. I believe, on the PNAS. That could be a good place to start. I believe using data from community, not necessarily at a granular level, but including some of the income and mostly focusing on the tsunami. But I think the other point that I want to add here is that I think that points to a large kind of missing component in discussion today. There's fascinating discussion, healthy conversation, is that human dimension. I think I think the workshop is purposely focusing more on that physical infrastructure, on that physical science side. But speaking of some of the life safety tsunami evacuation, I think there's a large portion of that decision making and that social side and of component. I think is I'll just use a study that we collected the empirical data from the 2018 Indonesia earthquake, the tsunami in Palu. I spent a week over there. We collected more than 500 household responses. And one thing that we learned was from that, I mean, not using those as, our communities in Oregon and Washington coast are similar, but one really surprising finding was around close to over 40% of the household and the people there that are not able to draw the link between a preceding earthquake is likely to be triggering a tsunami. And I think that is a really, I think that's something that it doesn't take, hundreds of millions or 15 of millions of dollars necessarily to help to move the lever. But the other one that we have worked with on the Oregon coast is the Coos Bay community and also the Crescent City in Northern California. From the surveys that we have done, but those surveys collected also inform some of the agent-based modeling of tsunami simulation that we have done. over the years, and collaboration with Dr. Dan Cox, starting that some years ago with Seaside. But one thing is that from the response was a lot of people that they draw their evacuation, either they don't have a plan. If they have a plan, okay, we ask them, what is your evacuation plan? Where is your shelter? And then many people have identified their destination is in the tsunami inundation zone, but they are not even aware of that. And I think I guess the point I want to make here is we need to bring that, behavioral side and, that social side into the discussion in speaking of the tsunami evacuation and life safety. And there is a large literature on that as well. But speaking of that SOVAL, there is a huge, area, and many of in the literature were using like Susan Cutter's definition of the SOVAL, but that social vulnerability is defined differently for, it's not necessarily defined differently from different type of hazards and as well. So I think there are also debates in terms of how that should be operationalized for tsunami vulnerability or versus some of the other hazards. Sorry, came a bit long.
Oh, one more with first. So I just want to quickly add something about the social vulnerability. Actually, we are doing some research to assess community resilience to multiple hazards, not only acute hazards, tsunami, earthquake, and we also incorporate others, flooding, erosion. But for these acute hazards, we do have one layer we call IDUs, individual development unit. That's just like what Dan mentioned, that we have the text log, and then we have the condo information for each building. Also, the different demographics, for example, the different income class, or the res age, and also res ownership, and some others. So we have lot of information, and we consider this. We assess the differential exposure to the different hazard zones, for example, seismic and the tsunami, and to evaluate or support the resilience acting. So, but it's just we use one county, the Timah County in Oregon, and so it's local, regional, rather than the national. But that's I want to add. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, one more comment, okay. You're the last one, and then I think.
I just want to say thank you to everyone for sharing your science eyes and growing my brain and answering my questions. That's all.